They called me a thief at my billionaire grandfather's will, reading, right there, in front of everyone who ever pretended to love me. My cousin, Madison, stood up first, her designer heels planted on the marble floor like she already owned the penthouse. Alexis doesn't deserve a single line of code from Samuel's legacy, she announced, pointing a manicured finger at me as if I were a bug in her perfect system. I looked at my father, Michael, expecting a flicker of defense. Instead, he stared at his holographic tablet, his silence as cold and calculated as an initial public offering. The room went silent, waiting for me to break. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, a suffocating weight designed to crush me into a confession. Michael and Madison were watching, their eyes scanning for a crack, a tremor in my lip, or a single tear they could use to categorize me as weak and guilty. But I did not cry. I did not ask why they were doing this. I did not even look at the lawyer to beg for a chance to explain. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I realized in that second that I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and my compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. This wasn't a family tragedy anymore. It was accounting. While Michael leaned over to whisper to the lawyer about my supposed lack of corporate loyalty, I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb moved with mechanical precision. They thought they were stripping me of a legacy, but they forgot one vital fact. I was the one who built the architecture they were currently standing on. 2 years ago, when Michael's firm was on the verge of a total server collapse, I had spent 3 weeks in a caffeine-fueled haze building their proprietary cloud infrastructure from scratch. I had done it for free. I had done it for the brand of family loyalty they preached, but never practiced. I opened the terminal app on my phone. The black screen and scrolling green text felt more like home than this cold marble library ever had. My father still held super admin status on the company's primary node. I had given it to him as a gesture of trust, a gift from a daughter to a father. Now, I saw it as a high-end subscription he had failed to pay for. I tapped the command to revoke. User Michael Hale administrative privileges removed. The screen blinked, confirming the execution. Next, I wiped the backup protocols and encrypted the source code with a key only I possessed. If they wanted to call me a thief, I might as well take back the intellectual property that actually belonged to me. Everything stayed silent for a few heartbeats. Then, across the room, Michael's holographic tablet chimed a sharp, discordant sound that cut through the library's artificial hush. His brow furrowed as he tapped the glass. Then, he tapped it again, more frantically. The system he used to run his entire multi-million-dollar empire was locking him out in real time. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, flickering realization. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a hint of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I stood up, smoothing my jacket. My grandfather used to say that love was a bond, but in this house, it had always been a contract. I had just terminated the agreement. I did not wait for his reaction. I did not wait for Madison to stop her gloating. I turned toward the glass elevator that looked out over the Palo Alto skyline. I am leaving, I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a dial tone. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along with their script. As the elevator doors hissed shut, my phone glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The hum of the glass elevator was the only sound in the shaft, a steady, mechanical frequency that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. As Palo Alto blurred into a series of expensive lights and glass towers below me, I let my mind drift back to the years of invisible labor that had built my father's comfort. While Madison was busy curating her online aesthetic with my grandfather's money, I was in the workshop with Samuel. My grandfather was a pioneer, a man whose mind moved at gigahertz speeds, even when his nervous system began to stall. He was building prototypes for a neural network interface that the rest of the tech world said was impossible. I was the only one who did not look at him and see a fading asset. I saw a genius who just needed a better compiler. I remember one specific night when I was 21 years old. I had just spent 48 hours straight debugging the kernel for Samuel's new operating system. I was exhausted, my eyes were bloodshot, and I probably smelled like stale coffee and determination. Michael had walked into the workshop, not to check on his father's health, but to demand I attend a gala for one of his venture capital partners. He looked at me with a disgust so pure, it was clinical. He told me I was a beta version of a daughter, a rough draft that he was tired of trying to patch. He said my social awkwardness and obsession with useless code were bugs in his perfect family system. That was the night he officially cut off my allowance to fund Madison's summer in Ibiza. He called it a necessary reallocation of resources. I see now that Michael wasn't just being a difficult parent. He had fallen into the trap of cruel normalization. To him, family wasn't a sanctuary of unconditional love. It was a portfolio of projects to be managed. In his mind, every interaction was a transaction, and every relative was an asset that needed to provide a high return on investment. If a project didn't meet the quarterly goals of his ego, he felt entirely justified in liquidating it. He had normalized the idea that people were interchangeable parts in a corporate machine. This is how he could stand in that library and watch me be called a thief without blinking. He didn't see it as a betrayal of his flesh and blood. He saw it as the final decommissioning of a faulty product line. My grandfather saw through the corporate mask Michael wore. Samuel once told me, as his hand shook too much to hold his tea, that the most dangerous people in the valley weren't the hackers or the rival executives, but the ones who couldn't tell the difference between a person and a piece of software. My father had reached that point years ago. He had spent decades treating my mother like a brand ambassador and me like an outdated operating system. He truly believed his own lies because he had programmed his reality to exclude anything that wasn't profitable. He thought he could delete me from the will and move on to the next version of his life without any consequences. But he made a fatal error in his logic. He assumed that because I was quiet and did not play his games, I was weak. He mistook my decency for stupidity and my silence for compliance. I had spent years watching him, analyzing his vulnerabilities like a system architect looking for a back door. I wasn't just fixing Samuel's prototypes. I was learning how to dismantle the very foundations of Michael's empire if the contract ever became too toxic to maintain. As the elevator doors opened into the cool night air of the lobby, I realized I was no longer the beta version he could discard. I was the system-wide update he never saw coming. The silence of my apartment was the only thing Michael and Madison couldn't touch. It felt like a clean slate, a sterile environment where cold facts could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of their manufactured expectations. But the peace was short-lived. My phone began to vibrate with a relentless, mechanical intensity that felt like the precursor to a total server crash. Madison had gone live. 2 million followers were currently tuning in to a carefully orchestrated performance of digital grief. She was sobbing perfect, crystalline tears that probably cost a fortune in professional lighting and high-definition filters. She wasn't just my cousin anymore. She was a digital executioner. She called me a crypto parasite and a traitor to our blood. She told her massive audience that I had exploited my proximity to our grandfather to hack his private wallets, siphoning off $1,500,000 while Samuel lay helpless in his final hours. It was a masterpiece of digital assassination. She was using the mob to do the work Michael was too cowardly to do himself. Within seconds, my father's follow-up message hit the screen. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a cold, clinical threat formatted like a corporate ultimatum. He told me that if the hardware wallets weren't returned by midnight, he would personally ensure I was blacklisted from every tech firm in Silicon Valley. He promised to make my name toxic from Sand Hill Road to the furthest reaches of the valley. He was doubling down on the lie, using his influence as a currency to buy my total submission. He did not care about the truth of the missing assets. He only cared about the leverage. My career was just another piece of hardware he was ready to scrap if it did not serve the motherboard of his ego. I sat in the flickering blue light of my dual monitors, watching the vitriol pour in through the comments. Strangers who did not know the difference between a bit and a byte were calling for my arrest. They were dissecting my life, my coldness, and my lack of social media presence, as if a preference for privacy was a smoking gun for a criminal mind. I did not feel the sting of the vitriol. I rubbed my eyes, not out of exhaustion, but out of a clinical need for clarity. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and the account was now permanently closed. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a hostile takeover. They weren't shocked by their own betrayal. They were merely shocked that I had stopped providing the free labor that kept their illusions running. I realized then how desperate they truly were. Madison did not look like a grieving grandchild. She looked like a gambler who had just realized the house always wins. She had likely lost that $1,500,000 herself, perhaps on a high-stakes vanity project or an unsecured exchange, and I was the convenient bug they needed to patch the hole in their reputation. Michael needed a villain to explain the missing millions to his board of directors before their next audit. Who better to frame than the beta version daughter who already lived in the shadows? They thought they could bury me under a landslide of manufactured outrage, but they forgot that I was the one who built the servers where they hosted their lies. I did not answer a single call. I did not issue a frantic counterstatement or post a tearful video of my own. I simply went back to my terminal. Every lie they broadcasted was just more metadata for the forensic trail I was beginning to reconstruct. This wasn't a breakdown. It was the initial phase of a total system purge. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of cold facts, verified ledgers, and a very quiet, very precise retribution. I closed the live stream and felt a cold, mechanical clarity settle into my bones. The digital air was thick with the scent of burnt static and silence, a heavy atmospheric pressure that usually precedes a total system failure. Madison and Michael had spent the last few hours trying to hack the narrative, but they had forgotten that log files do not have emotions. In the world of data, there is no such thing as a beta version daughter or a traitor to the blood. There are only inputs, outputs, and an immutable ledger of truth. I did not reach out to my father to plead for my reputation. I did not send a cease and desist letter to Madison. Instead, I made one phone call to a man I had worked with during my time consulting for high-level security firms. His name was Marcus, a forensic data analyst who specialized in tracking the kind of ghost transactions that leave behind a whisper of a trail. I did not ask for a favor. I offered him a contract with a guaranteed payout. This wasn't a family plea. It was a professional engagement. Marcus and I spent the next several hours inside an encrypted digital workspace. We weren't looking for apologies or context. We were hunting for the $1,500,000 that had supposedly vanished from my grandfather's private hardware wallets. Michael had claimed I siphoned the funds, but the blockchain is a mirror that never distorts the reflection. As we sifted through the transaction metadata, the emotional noise of the last few days faded into a series of predictable algorithms. The first breakthrough came when we identified the exit node used to authorize the final transfer. My father had been so busy doubling down on his public threats that he hadn't noticed his own daughter was tracing the digital footprint back to its source. The burnt static I felt in my chest intensified as Marcus flagged a recurring internet protocol address. It wasn't a random hacker in a distant country. It was an address registered to the high-speed fiber line inside the very penthouse library where they had called me a thief. Even more specific, the signature of the device that had initiated the transfer belonged to a high-end mobile device with a very specific hardware identification. I cross-referenced the identification with the family's shared service plan. The device wasn't mine. It was the latest model of the phone Michael had bought for Madison as a reward for her growing follower count. We followed the trail further. tracking the $1,500,000 as it moved through a series of tumblers before landing in a margin call account for a high-risk meme coin that had collapsed 48 hours prior. Madison hadn't just stolen the money. She had gambled the family's liquid legacy on a desperate attempt to fund her vanity projects, and she had lost every single penny. Michael wasn't just a victim of her lies. He was a co-conspirator who needed my blacklisting to serve as the ultimate firewall for his own professional negligence. They weren't shocked by their own betrayal. They were merely terrified of the audit that was coming. "I have the forensic chain," Marcus said, his voice as clinical as my own. "It's a perfect sequence. There's no way for them to delete this history." I thanked him and terminated the call. I sat in the blue light of my monitors, looking at the verified evidence of their moral and financial bankruptcy. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet that finally balanced. They had spent years treating me like a bug in their system, but they were about to discover that I was the one who controlled the source code. I did not stop with a digital ledger. I needed the kill shot, the definitive evidence that would trigger the morality clause in my grandfather's will. Samuel had always been a step ahead of everyone in Palo Alto, and even in his final days, he had left a hidden partition in the penthouse server labeled the Samuel Archive. Inside, I found a voice authorization log dated 4 days before he passed. The voice was unmistakably Samuel's, authorizing the transfer of $1,500,000 to Madison's private accounts. But the metadata did not lie. It wasn't a live recording. It was a deep fake, an artificial reconstruction of his voice generated by Michael's company software. They hadn't just stolen from him. They had engaged in systematic, technological elder abuse while he was semi-conscious on a morphine drip. I walked back into the penthouse an hour later. The library still smelled like old money and new lies. Michael was sitting in Samuel's leather chair, swirling a glass of whiskey, while Madison was busy checking her engagement numbers on her phone. They looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting from irritation to a predatory curiosity. Michael did not even wait for me to sit. "Did you bring the hardware wallets, Alexis?" he asked, his voice dripping with a false, heavy compassion. "Return the $1,500,000 now, and maybe I can convince the board to let you disappear quietly." I did not answer him with words. I bypassed the server lock I had placed earlier and tapped a final command on my phone. The library's holographic display flickered to life, projecting a massive screen over the fireplace. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a recording from the library's own security cameras, hidden in plain sight. "Once we make them believe it's Alexis," Michael's recorded voice filled the room, "the board will never question the audit discrepancies. She's the perfect bug to blame for a system crash." On the screen, Madison laughed as she held Samuel's phone, practicing the deep fake voice authorization. "She's so quiet," Madison whispered in the video. "She'll just crawl back into her little dark corner and cry while we spend the inheritance." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's glass shattered on the marble floor. He looked at the screen, then at me, his face drained of every ounce of blood. Madison started to shake, her crystalline tears finally looking real as she realized her 2 million followers wouldn't be able to filter this out. "Alexis, wait," Michael stammered, his voice cracking as he stood up. "Let's be reasonable. We can split the estate. We're family." I looked at them and realized their power had always been an illusion. They were suffering from the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For years, they had confused Samuel's wealth for their own internal value. They thought the money made them untouchable, but in reality, their status was just a luxury they had been renting with my grandfather's resources. Without his billions to shield them, they were just two desperate people caught in a web of their own making. They had no internal structure, no integrity to lean on when the financial floor collapsed. "You aren't family," I said, my voice factual and lethal. "You're just data I've successfully purged." I did not wait for the police I had already called to arrive. I simply walked out of the penthouse, leaving them to face the consequences of a system that finally had no more room for their bugs. The legal aftermath was swift and as unyielding as the code I write. Michael and Madison did not just lose a legacy, they lost their proximity to power, and in Palo Alto, that is a fate worse than prison. Michael faced federal charges for fraud and technological elder abuse, his career effectively deleted from the industry directory. Madison's brand was permanently canceled, her 2 million followers evaporating as soon as they realized her aesthetic was built on theft. I heard later that Michael was working a low-level consulting gig for a fraction of his former salary, while Madison was barely making ends meet in telemarketing. They had spent their lives performing success, but without Samuel's billions to prop up the stage, they had nothing left to stand on. As for me, I stood on the balcony of the penthouse 6 months after that will reading and finally let out a breath I had been holding for years. The full transfer of the billion-dollar tech empire was complete. I was no longer the beta version of a daughter or a bug in a perfect system. I was simply Alexis, the architect of a future that had nothing to do with their greed. But I did not keep the mansion as a monument to my victory. I did not want to live in a house that still carried the echoes of their betrayal. I realized then that there are two types of justice. There is the justice of punishment, which focuses on the debris of the past, and there is the justice of the sower, which focuses on the potential of the future. I had already seen the villains fall, but that was just the beginning. True justice wasn't just about Michael and Madison losing everything. It was about ensuring that Samuel's life's work was used for something constructive. I used the resources I inherited to establish the Samuel Hale Foundation for underprivileged coders. I turned the empty library, the very place where they called me a thief, into a high-tech training center for kids who have the talent but lack the access. I wanted to help others like me break the cycle of being underestimated and exploited. This was my real inheritance. The understanding that the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies, but becoming everything they said you couldn't be while you're busy building something beautiful. One evening, I received one final message from Michael. He told me he was struggling, that he was my father and he needed help. I did not feel anger, and I did not feel pity. I simply typed back that I would donate the exact amount they had stolen, $1,500,000, to the foundation in their names. I told him that would be the only legacy they would ever have. Then I hit delete and blocked the number for good. That night, for the first time in my life, I slept through until morning with no guilt and no noise. If this story reminded you that your value isn't measured by those who try to use you, hit the share button and join our community.